The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Corwin Ashford, Duke of Thornfield, turned his horse down the muddy lane toward Briarsgate Manor. He hadn't ridden ahead, hadn't sent a rider or a card, or as much as a whispered intention through the usual channels of gentlemen's correspondence. That was the point. Anselm Margrave was his oldest friend, the one man in England who'd never lied to him, and Corwin needed that honesty now more than he needed air. The manor appeared through the curtain of rain like a painting left out in the weather, its edges softened and its colors bleeding. Smaller than Corwin remembered. Or perhaps he'd simply grown accustomed to the sprawling emptiness of Thornfield Hall, where every corridor echoed with the absence of voices that should have filled them. He dismounted without waiting for a groom, his boots sinking into the gravel as he led his horse toward the stable block. The rain had soaked through his greatcoat, plastered his dark hair against his temples, and he could feel the cold settling into his bones with the familiar ache of exhaustion. 3 days of riding, 3 days of trying to outrun the hollow feeling that had taken up residence in his chest nearly 5 years ago and refused to leave. The stable door was ajar. He pushed through it, expecting the quiet warmth of horses and hay, expecting silence. What he found instead stopped him mid-stride, his hand still on the door, his breath caught somewhere between his lungs and the rain-soaked air. A child was singing. The voice was small and clear, threading through the dim stable like light through a crack. A nonsense melody, the kind children invent when they think no one is listening, words tumbling over each other in happy disregard for rhythm or meaning. Corwin stood perfectly still, water dripping from his coat onto the flagstones, and listened. She was sitting on an overturned bucket beside the third stall, a girl of perhaps 4 years old, her dark hair escaping from a ribbon that had clearly been tied with care and abandoned with enthusiasm. She wore a pinafore smudged with something that might have been mud or might have been jam, and she was feeding apple slices to a gray mare with the solemn concentration of someone performing an act of tremendous importance. Corwin's chest constricted, not because the child was remarkable in any obvious way, though she was lovely in the careless manner of all small children, but because her hair was dark, nearly black, and it curled at the temples in a way he recognized with the force of a physical blow. The way Marin's hair had curled, he must have made a sound, some involuntary thing, half breath, half something raw, because the child looked up. Her eyes were blue, wide and startled, and for a moment they simply stared at each other across the stable, the Duke and the girl, both equally surprised by the other's existence. "You're very wet," she said. The words broke something open inside him, something he'd spent years sealing shut with duty and distance and the grim machinery of estate management. His throat tightened. "I am," he managed. "You should come inside. Mama says people catch their death standing about in wet things." She slid off the bucket with the boneless grace of childhood. "Are you here to see Mr. Margrave?" Mama. The word detonated in his mind. He opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. "Yes, I'm a friend of Mr. Margrave's. He's very nice," the child informed him, already leading the gray mare back toward her stall, with an authority that suggested she'd done this many times. "He lets me ride Clover when the weather's fine, but not today because of the rain." She glanced back at him with an expression of profound injustice. "I don't mind the rain." "Neither do I," Corwin said, though he could barely feel his fingers. "Luelle!" A voice from the doorway of the stable, sharp with worry, soft with the breathlessness of a mother who's lost sight of her child for too long. "Luelle, where have you—" The voice stopped. Corwin turned, and the world, the rain, the stable, the child singing, the years of grief and searching and hollow, screaming loss, all of it collapsed into a single point of impossible, devastating recognition. She stood in the doorway, framed by gray light, her hand gripping the wooden frame as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, cut to her shoulders, and she was thinner, her cheekbones sharper beneath skin that had lost its summer warmth. She wore a plain dress of dark blue wool, no jewelry, no ornament, nothing of the woman who'd once stood beside him in silk and sapphires at the Thornfield autumn ball. But her eyes were exactly the same. Dark brown, almost black, with that quality of attention that had made him feel, from the very first moment he'd met her, like she could see straight through every wall he'd ever built. "Maren," he said. Her face went white. Not pale. White, the color of paper, of ash, of absolute terror. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no. Papa!" The child's voice came from behind him, small and confused, and utterly, impossibly certain. "Mama, is that my papa?" The stable spun. Corwin reached for the door frame, missed it, found a post instead, and held on as his mind tried to process what his eyes were showing him and his heart already knew. His wife was alive. His wife, who'd been declared dead nearly 5 years ago after the carriage accident on the Dover Road. His wife, whose funeral he'd attended in a black daze, whose empty coffin he'd watched, lowered into Thornfield soil because they'd never recovered the body from the river. His wife, for whom he'd worn mourning until the fabric of his black coats had gone threadbare at the elbows. She was alive. She was standing 10 feet away from him, and she had a daughter who called her Mama and had Maren's dark curling hair and knew the word, Papa, like she'd been taught it, practiced it, held it ready for exactly this moment. "Maren," his voice cracked on her name. "What have you done?" She didn't answer. She looked at the child, then at Corwin, then at the rain behind her, as if calculating whether she could disappear into it. "Don't." The word came out harder than he intended, rough with years of grief converting rapidly to something far more dangerous. "Don't you dare run from me. Not again." Footsteps on the gravel behind Maren. Anselm Margrave appeared, slightly out of breath, his fair hair disheveled, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition to absolute horror in the space of 2 heartbeats. "Corwin," Anselm said. "God in heaven. Corwin, I can explain." Corwin looked at his oldest friend, looked at his wife, looked at the child who was watching all 3 adults with the wide, bewildered attention of someone who understands that something enormous is happening, but cannot grasp its shape. "Someone," he said very quietly, "is going to explain. Right now." No one moved. Rain hammered the stable roof like an audience demanding a performance no one was prepared to give. Luelle pressed herself against the gray mare's stall, her small hand gripping the wooden slats, her gaze darting between the 3 adults who'd turned to stone around her. Anselm spoke first, which was characteristic. He'd always been the one to fill silences, to smooth edges, to pour words into the cracks before they could widen into something irreparable. "Come inside," he said. "All of you. This isn't a conversation for a stable." Isn't it? Corwin hadn't moved from the post he was gripping, knuckles white. A stable seems rather appropriate, given that I've apparently been treated like an animal led to slaughter for years. "Corwin, 5 years." The words were precise, surgical. 5 years I believed she was dead. 5 years of waking every morning to the agony of reaching for someone who isn't there. And she's been here. With you. In your house, Anselm. Maren flinched. It was a small movement, barely visible. But Corwin caught it because he'd spent 5 years of marriage learning to read her body the way other men read account books, with attention, with care, with the knowledge that the margins held as much information as the figures. "Luelle," Maren said, and her voice was remarkably steady for a woman who looked like she might shatter. "Go inside with Mr. Margrave. Go to the kitchen. Mrs. Padmore will give you something warm." "But Mama, now, darling, please." The child looked at Corwin one more time, something searching in her blue eyes, then took Anselm's outstretched hand and allowed herself to be led toward the house. Anselm glanced back once, his expression a wreck of guilt and pleading, before they disappeared into the rain. Silence closed around them like a fist. "She called me Papa," Corwin said, Marin's arms wrapped around herself, a gesture he remembered from their courtship, from the early days of their marriage, when she'd been uncertain of her place in his world. Self-protection disguised as cold. "I told her about you," she said. "Every night. Stories about her father, the Duke who loved books and rode too fast and couldn't carry a tune but sang to his horse anyway. I wanted her to know you, even if she never," her voice broke, "even if she never met you. Why would she never meet me?" He stepped toward her, and she stepped back. The dance of it, the retreat in advance, felt obscenely familiar. "I'm her father. I'm your husband. Why, Marin? Why would you let me believe you were dead?" "Because I had to." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now." "That's not good enough." "I know." Tears slid down her face, silent and steady, and she made no move to wipe them away. "I know it's not good enough. Nothing I say will be good enough. But I need you to understand that I didn't do this to hurt you." "You didn't do this to hurt me." He repeated it flatly, tasting each word. "You faked your own death. You hid my child from me. You've been living in my best friend's house under God knows what pretense, and you didn't do this to hurt me." "I did it to protect you." The laugh that escaped him was ugly, nothing like humor. "Protect me from what?" Her mouth opened, closed. She glanced toward the house, where light glowed in the kitchen windows, where their daughter was probably eating something warm and wondering why her mother was crying, and the wet man in the stable looked at her like she was a ghost. "Not here," Marin said. "Please, I'll tell you everything, but not here. Not standing in a stable in the rain like strangers." "We are strangers?" The cruelty of it surprised even him. But the pain beneath his ribs had teeth, and it was biting. "The woman I married would never have done this. I don't know who you are." She absorbed the blow without flinching this time. Something in her straightened, some quiet scaffolding of resolve that he remembered from the earliest days of their acquaintance, when she'd been a vicar's daughter, with no fortune and no connections, and a spine made of something harder than any titled lady he'd ever met. "Then come inside," she said, "and find out." She turned and walked toward the house without waiting for his answer, without looking back. The rain swallowed her within 3 steps, but she didn't hurry. Walked through the downpour as if it couldn't touch her, as if she'd already survived worse. Corwin stood alone in the stable. The gray mare nudged his shoulder, and the absurdity of it, the horse, the rain, the singing child, his dead wife walking through the storm, hit him with such force that he had to press his forehead against the post and breathe. Years of grief. Years of learning how to exist without her. Years of refusing to remarry despite his mother's relentless pressure, despite Parliament, despite the title demanding an heir he'd believed he'd never have. And she'd been here, alive, with his child. He pushed off the post and followed her into the rain. The kitchen at Briarsgate was warm and bright, copper pots gleaming on hooks, the smell of bread and wood smoke filling the low-ceilinged room. Luelle sat at the scrubbed table with a cup of warm milk, her legs swinging, watching Corwin enter with the frank assessment only children and dowagers could manage. "You're still wet," she observed. "I am." "Mama says you should change your clothes. Your mama says a great many things." He caught Marin's eye across the room. She stood by the fire, arms still wrapped around herself, her expression a fortress. Not all of them true, apparently. The barb landed. He saw it hit. But Marin only turned to Mrs. Padmore, a broad woman with a kind face and suspicious eyes. "Could you take Luelle to the nursery? She hasn't had her afternoon rest." "I'm not tired," Luelle said, with the absolute conviction of a child who was clearly exhausted. "Nursery," Marin repeated gently, and the child went, trailing protests and biscuit crumbs. When they were alone, Marin said, "Anselm has offered us the drawing room. How generous of him, considering he's been harboring my wife and child." She met his eyes, and beneath the fear and the guilt, he saw something else. Something that looked, impossibly, like relief. "I've been carrying this alone for so long. I'm tired, Corwin, so tired. Please, let me put it down." It was the tiredness that broke through. Not the tears, not the pleading, but the exhaustion in her voice, the way it mirrored something in his own chest that he'd been refusing to acknowledge since the funeral. "The drawing room," he said, "and Anselm joins us. Whatever this is, he's part of it." She led him through the narrow hallway to a modest room with faded wallpaper and furniture that had seen better decades. Anselm was already there, standing by the window with the posture of a man awaiting sentencing. "Sit down," Corwin told him, "both of you, and start from the beginning." Marin sat in the chair nearest the fire, not for warmth, but for distance. She needed the length of the room between herself and Corwin, needed the space to say what she had to say, without his proximity scrambling her thoughts the way it always had, the way it was doing even now. Anselm sat on the settee, his hands clasped between his knees. Corwin remained standing. He'd always commanded rooms from his feet, never from a chair. "The accident on the Dover Road was real," Marin began. Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears, thin and careful. "The carriage overturned. The driver was killed. I was pulled from the wreckage by a farmer who happened to be passing. I was badly injured, unconscious for nearly a week. When I woke, I was in a cottage near Folkestone, 2 broken ribs, a gash on my head. But I remembered why I'd been on the Dover Road in the first place. You told me you were visiting your aunt in Canterbury. I lied." The 2 words fell like stones into water. I'd received a letter from a man named Severin Cole, an associate of my father's, years ago before we met. My father wasn't only a vicar, Corwin. He also did work for the Home Office, quietly, passing information across the channel during the war, using his parish connections as cover. Your father was a spy, an intermediary. He believed it was his duty. She moved to the window, where rain still streaked the glass. Call was one of the men on the other side of those transactions. French by birth, English by convenience, loyal to no one by nature. When my father died, I thought it was over. Then I met you, and everything changed. I became the Duchess of Thornfield. I thought the past was buried. But Call's letter said he had documents proving my father's involvement in operations that had gone wrong. People who died because information was mishandled. If I didn't meet him in Dover with money, he'd make everything public. You were being blackmailed. Corwin's composure cracked. Not much. A hairline fracture across the stone of his expression. And you didn't come to me. How could I? Marin turned from the window, and the anguish in her face was raw, unmanaged. You'd married a vicar's daughter, a quiet, respectable woman with no secrets. How could I tell you that my father had been passing intelligence to foreign agents? That people may have died because of his work? That a man was threatening to make it all public, to attach the name Thornfield to scandal and treason? You could have told me the truth and let me help you. And what would you have done? Paid him? He'd have come back for more. Confronted him? He'd have released the documents. Your mother spent the first 2 years of our marriage trying to convince you I wasn't good enough. Can you imagine what she would have done with the knowledge that my father was involved in espionage? The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with truths neither wanted to examine. Because she wasn't wrong. The carriage overturned before I reached over. When I woke in that cottage, the farmer's wife told me word had already spread. The Duchess of Thornfield was dead. The river had taken the body. Search parties called off. I called them off, Corwin said, and his voice was barely recognizable. After 6 days, they told me there was no hope. And when I understood you believed I was dead, I made a decision, the worst decision of my life. If Marin Ashford, Duchess of Thornfield, no longer existed, then Call had no one to blackmail. The documents about my father became meaningless. No scandal could touch you or the title. You stayed dead. I thought you'd be safe. Not from where I'm standing. Anselm cleared his throat. She came to me 3 years after the accident. She'd been living under a false name in a boarding house in Ramsgate with Llewellyn, who was barely a year old. Alone with a small child, terrified Call would discover she was alive. The room tilted. Corwin gripped the back of a chair. I didn't know I was with child when the accident happened, Marin said, tears falling freely now. Not until weeks later. By then I'd already let you believe I was gone. I had Llewellyn alone. When she was old enough to travel, I went to Anselm. He was the only person I trusted. Corwin looked at his oldest friend, the man who'd stood beside him at his wedding, who'd held his shoulder at the funeral, who'd written letters of condolence so tender they'd made Corwin weep alone in his study at midnight. You sat across from me at her funeral, Corwin said. You spoke. You said she was the finest woman you'd ever known. You cried. Every word was true, Anselm said, and every tear was real. I was grieving what she'd lost, what you'd both lost, what I was helping to destroy by keeping her secret. You lied to me. For years. Yes. And if I hadn't come here today, unannounced, if I'd sent a card or a letter like a proper gentleman, would you have hidden her? Sent her to another room, another house? The pause before Anselm answered was a fraction too long, and it told Corwin everything. I see. He moved toward the door. I'm not leaving. I'm going upstairs to change before I catch my death, as my daughter so wisely advised. When I come back, you're going to tell me everything about Severin Call. He paused, and his voice held something more terrifying than anger. The quiet, immovable authority of a man who'd just discovered he had something to fight for. Because I buried you once, Marin. I'm not doing it again. He left the room, and the silence he left behind was louder than the storm. Corwin returned in dry clothes that belonged to Anselm and fit him poorly, too short in the sleeves, too loose across the shoulders. It should have diminished him. It didn't. He entered the drawing room with the controlled energy of a man who'd used every minute upstairs to convert shock into strategy. Marin and Anselm hadn't moved. They sat exactly where he'd left them, a tableau of guilt and exhaustion, waiting for judgment. Tell me about Call, Corwin said, taking the chair opposite Marin. No preamble, no softening. Marin explained. After the accident, she'd sent word through an intermediary that the Duchess was dead. Years of silence followed. Then letters began arriving at Briarsgate. 3 over the past year, each more specific than the last. Call knew the death was fabricated. He wanted access, introductions, the Thornfield name opening political and military doors. Corwin read the letters in silence. Marin watched his face change, the tightening around his mouth, the way his fingers pressed harder against the paper with each page. He's not asking for money anymore, Corwin said. He wants legitimacy, the kind of access that could do real damage. And if I refuse, he releases everything. My father's involvement, the failed operations, the names of people who died, the Duke who married the traitor's daughter. My father wasn't a traitor, Marin added quietly. He was a man who tried to serve his country and made mistakes. But Call has the documents arranged to tell a very different story. Corwin moved to the window. Here's what I don't understand. You chose to carry this alone. You chose to hide my daughter. And it never occurred to you that I might be able to handle the truth. It wasn't about handling it. It was about what it would cost you. You don't get to decide what I can afford to lose. He turned, and the anger in his face had shifted into something harder and more complex. You made me a widower, Marin. You made me bury an empty coffin. You made my mother so unbearable with grief that she spent years trying to marry me off to every eligible woman in 3 counties just to ensure the line continues. You let me believe I'd failed you, that I should have been there, should have insisted on a better carriage, a different route, a safer day to travel. His voice broke on the last word, and for the first time since the stable, she saw the grief beneath the fury. Not the controlled, performed grief of a duke managing a tragedy, but the raw, bleeding thing underneath. I replayed every decision, he said. Every morning, Marin. What if I'd gone with her? What if I'd canceled Parliament? What if I'd told her I loved her one more time before she left? The guilt of a man who believes he could have prevented his wife's death. Do you have any idea what that does to a person? Yes, because I've been living with the guilt of causing it. The silence between them was different now. Not cold accusation, but the heavy silence of 2 people who'd both been drowning and only just realized they'd been in the same water. I have conditions, Marin said. You have conditions. First, Luelle is not leverage. She's not a bargaining piece, not a public revelation to be timed for maximum effect. Whatever we decide about Call, about the marriage, about the future, her safety comes first. Always. Agreed. What else? Second, I'm part of every decision, not informed after the fact, present and participating. Also agreed, though your last independent decision involved faking your own death, so perhaps some collaboration is warranted. It was so precisely the kind of dry observation the Corwin she'd married would have made that Marin almost laughed. Third, when this is resolved, I decide what comes next. For me and for Luelle. If I choose to return to Thornfield, it's because I choose it. I won't be installed back into a life like a painting rehung on a wall because it suits the composition. You're asking me to accept that I might get you back only to lose you again. I'm asking you to let me choose freely. Agreed. All 3. Now I have one of my own. I want to know my daughter, starting now. Whatever you and I are to each other, I've lost years of her life. I won't lose another day. This one cost Marin. She could see what it meant for him, the raw, undisguised hunger of a father who'd missed his daughter's first word, first steps, first everything. But she could also see what it would mean for Luelle, a father appearing fully formed, expecting to fill a space that had been imaginary until 3 days ago. Children adapted, but children also broke. On one condition, she said, you're negotiating my negotiation. I'm asking you to let her set the pace. She's been told about you. She wants to know you. But wanting and being ready aren't always the same thing. Fair. He held out his hand, not to shake, to hold. The gesture was so simple, so instinctive, that she took it before she could think. His fingers closed around hers, and the warmth of it, the shock of touching him after so long, sent something electric through her chest. Then we have an agreement, Corwin said. Now, let's discuss how to destroy Severin Call. The world didn't end that afternoon. It simply rearranged itself into a shape none of them recognized. Corwin sent word to Thornfield that he'd been delayed. He gave no reason. Dukes were not required to give reasons, which was one of the few advantages of the title that he appreciated without reservation. For now, he stayed. Briarsgate was nothing like Thornfield. 11 rooms instead of 50. A staff of Mrs. Padmore, the housekeeper, a cook named Odile, who sang hymns while she worked, 2 maids, and a groundskeeper so elderly, he appeared to be part of the landscape. The furniture was comfortable rather than impressive. A cat of uncertain lineage had claimed the best chair in the parlor as sovereign territory and defended it with the focused aggression of a creature that had never heard of the aristocracy and wouldn't have been impressed if it had. Llewellyn took to Corwin's presence with the terrifying adaptability of children who've been primed for exactly this moment. She'd been told stories about her father for as long as she could remember, had built him in her imagination from Marin's nightly tales, and now here he was, real and awkward, trying to fit himself into the outline of the man she'd invented. "Do you really sing to your horse?" she asked him on the second morning, standing in the nursery doorway with 2 uneven braids she'd attempted herself, badly. "Mama said you can't carry a tune in a wheelbarrow. Your mama is accurate. I can sing very well. I'll teach you." And so Corwin found himself sitting on the nursery floor at 9 in the morning, being instructed in a song about a hedgehog and a spoon by a 4-year-old with absolute confidence in her pedagogical abilities. His voice was terrible. Llewellyn corrected him with patient ruthlessness. He tried again. Failed again. She patted his hand with the solemnity of a physician delivering a grim diagnosis. "It's all right, Papa. Some people are better at other things." Papa. Every time she said it, the word opened something in his chest that hurt in the most extraordinary way, like blood returning to a limb that's been numb for too long. He learned her routines, breakfast, then lessons with Marin, then exploration of the estate. She showed him every corner of Briarsgate, with the pride of a landowner conducting a survey. The brook was important. The old oak with the low branch was essential. The spot where she'd once seen a fox was sacred ground, though the fox had not been seen since, and might, she conceded, have been a large cat. In the library, she pointed to a copy of Don Quixote that Corwin recognized as one he'd given Marin during the early months of their marriage, with her father's notes still penciled in the margins. She'd brought it through everything, through the accident, the false death, the years of hiding. She'd kept this one book from their life together, and the fact of it lodged in his chest like something sharp and necessary. Marin was careful around him, polite, cooperative, transparent about call, but careful. She occupied her side of an invisible line and stayed there. It drove him slowly mad, not because he wanted her to be different, but because he remembered how she used to be. The way she'd lean into him while reading, the way she'd steal food from his plate, the way she'd challenge his opinions with such passionate conviction that he'd once conceded a point about Keats just to watch her smile in victory. That version of Marin surfaced sometimes, in flashes, in the way she corrected Llewellyn's grammar with affectionate precision, in the way she reorganized Anselm's bookshelves without asking permission, in the way she stood in the garden at dusk with her face turned toward the last light, exactly as she'd done at Thornfield, as if she could store the warmth against whatever darkness was coming. On the 3rd evening, he found her in the library with a book she wasn't reading. "I wrote to my solicitor," he said, "about the legal implications of a wife declared dead being discovered alive." "And?" "Complex, but manageable." She set her book aside. "You've been here 3 days, but we haven't discussed what happens when you leave. When you return to Thornfield, to Parliament, to your mother and the title and every expectation that comes with them. What happens to Llewellyn then? To me? We decide together. You say that. But you're a duke. You're accustomed to deciding things and having them happen. This is a child who calls this place home, and a woman who isn't sure she can survive being the Duchess of Thornfield again. Why not? Because the Duchess of Thornfield was terrified every single day of your mother's judgment, of society's scrutiny, of being found lacking in 100 invisible ways. I loved you, Corwin. I loved our life. But I was drowning in it, and I didn't know how to tell you because you seemed so certain everything was fine. I thought you were happy. I was happy with you. I was miserable with everything else, and I didn't know how to have one without the other. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the house, the old cat yowled at a closed door. Outside, the Briarsgate night was dark and quiet in a way that Thornfield, with its army of servants and its relentless machinery of running a great estate, never was. Then we change everything else, Corwin said. You can't change society, Corwin. You can't change your mother. You can't change 300 years of expectations about what a duchess should be. I can change what I expect, and I can stop assuming that because I'm comfortable in that world, everyone around me must be comfortable too. He paused. I failed you, Marin, not by letting you take that carriage, by not seeing that you were drowning. That's on me. She stared at him. In 5 years of marriage, she'd never heard him admit to failing at anything that wasn't a horse race or a hand of cards. You weren't responsible for... I was your husband. Seeing you was my responsibility, and I didn't see. Marin looked at him, and for the first time since the stable, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't fear or guilt or careful management. It was the faintest, most tentative flicker of hope. On the 5th day, the gatekeeper arrived. Corwin heard the carriage before he saw it, the crisp percussion of matched horses on gravel. He was in the garden with Luelle, who was showing him how to identify beetle species on the underside of leaves when the sound reached them. He knew. Before the carriage rounded the bend, before the door swung open, before the black silk and silver-topped cane appeared, he knew. Perpetua Ashford, Dowager Duchess of Thornfield, descended with the precision of a woman who'd been dismounting from carriages for 63 years and had perfected each movement to eliminate any suggestion of effort. She was not tall, but she had never needed height. What she possessed instead was density, a compression of will and expectation and social authority into a frame that seemed to occupy more space than physics should allow. Don't mother me in that tone, she said, before Corwin had finished his first word. She fixed him with eyes that were, unsettlingly, exactly his own. Blue, sharp, missing nothing. Your solicitor's clerk has a weakness for brandy and a stronger weakness for gossip. I've known for 2 days that you're here, and I've known for 1 day why. In the drawing room, she sat in the best chair, the one the cat usually occupied, and leveled her gaze at Marin with the unblinking focus of a hawk. You married my son against my wishes. I tolerated it because he was determined. I spent 3 years attempting to polish you into something suitable. I arranged introductions, corrected your comportment, defended your origins to people who questioned them, and you repaid me by dying. I repaid you by trying to protect your family from scandal. Scandal? You think I can't manage scandal? I've managed scandal since before you were born. I managed your husband's grandfather's gambling debts. I managed the rumor that the Thornfield fortune was built on smuggling, which, incidentally, it partially was. Scandal is not a crisis, girl. It's a weather pattern. You prepare for it, endure it, and move on. You think I would have let some French bottom feeder with forged documents destroy a 300-year-old dukedom? I would have crushed him before he finished his first sentence. I would have had him deported, discredited, and living in a ditch within a fortnight. But you didn't give me the chance. You didn't give any of us the chance. Because you decided, alone, frightened, and convinced you were the only person capable of managing the situation, that dying was preferable to trusting your family. The words struck Marin with visible force, not because they were unkind, but because buried inside was an accusation she couldn't deny. She hadn't trusted them. She hadn't trusted Corwin to handle the truth, hadn't trusted the Dowager to fight the battle, hadn't trusted the machinery of the dukedom to protect its own. "You're right," Marin said. The Dowager blinked. Whatever she'd expected, it wasn't concession. "I should have come to you. Both of you. I should have trusted that the family I'd married into was strong enough to withstand the threat. I was afraid, and I let that fear make my decisions. And in doing so, I caused more damage than Call's documents ever could have." When the Dowager demanded to be left alone with Marin, Corwin obeyed reluctantly. Inside, the Dowager's voice changed. Stripped of performance, the voice she used when the audience was gone, and only the truth remained. "I mourned you," she said. "Not publicly. I don't do things publicly unless they serve a purpose. But privately, in my rooms, alone, I mourned the woman my son loved. Because whatever I thought of your origins, you made him happy. Genuinely, foolishly, recklessly happy. And when you died, I watched that happiness drain out of him like blood from a wound. I watched him become his grandfather. Cold, dutiful, empty. And I swore I would fix it. I would find him another wife, someone who could at least approximate what you'd given him." Marin was crying now, silently, her hands gripping each other in her lap. "So when I say I could have managed the scandal, I'm not boasting. I'm telling you that I would have done anything to spare my son what he's been through, and you took that chance from me." "I'm sorry," Marin whispered. "Sorry doesn't give me back 5 years of watching my son disappear into himself. Sorry doesn't undo the funeral I attended for an empty coffin." The Dowager's voice went hoarse. "Sorry doesn't change the fact that I stood in my son's study and watched him hold your portrait and weep, and I could do nothing. Nothing. Because I didn't know you were alive." The clock ticked. The fire crackled. Outside, a bird sang with the oblivious cheerfulness of a creature unburdened by human catastrophe. "Show me the child," the Dowager said. Corwin lifted Luelle onto his hip. She studied the Dowager with the fearless curiosity that was her defining trait. The Dowager studied her back. 2 pairs of blue eyes, separated by 6 decades, conducting a mutual assessment with identical intensity. "She has the Ashford eyes," the Dowager said quietly. "She has my temperament," Marin said. "God help us all," but her hand trembled. "Come here, child." Luelle crossed the room with fearless directness. "Hello, I'm Luelle. I can sing. Do you want to hear?" The Dowager's composure, the iron architecture of 63 years of aristocratic self-control, shattered. She pulled the child onto her lap with a fierceness that was not gentle, but was, unmistakably, love. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "I very much want to hear." When the song ended, Luelle patted the Dowager's cheek with one small hand. "You're crying. I'm furious. 5 years I could have known her." "I know," Marin said. "This is unforgivable. I know." When Luelle departed without protest, evidently satisfied that the important lady had passed inspection, the Dowager pressed her lips together, wiped her face with one efficient motion, and became, once again, formidable. "This is what will happen. You will return to Thornfield. All of you. The child will be presented as your daughter. We will construct a story. Illness, convalescence abroad, a physician's orders for solitude. It will be thin. People will talk. I don't care. What matters is the official narrative." "And Call?" Corwin asked. The Dowager's eyes turned cold. Leave call to me. The return to Thornfield was orchestrated with the Dowager's characteristic precision. The household received Marin with the warmth of servants who'd genuinely liked their mistress. Mrs. Calloway, the housekeeper, wept openly. Dawes, the butler, cleared his throat 7 times during his welcome speech and had to excuse himself. The kitchen sent up a meal 3 courses more elaborate than necessary, which was the cook's way of saying what she couldn't put into words. Luelle was overwhelmed, becoming quiet and attached to Marin's skirt. She fell asleep that first night clutching a stuffed rabbit that Mrs. Calloway produced with the cryptic explanation that it had been waiting. The first test came 3 days later. Lady Whitmore was hosting an afternoon gathering and had specifically requested the Duchess of Thornfield. "They want to inspect me," Marin said. "Same thing, different verb. You'll be charming, composed, and appropriately grateful. If someone asks directly, you look them in the eye and say some experiences are too painful to discuss. Sympathy is a weapon, girl. Learn to wield it." Marin wore a dress of deep gray silk the Dowager had commissioned from London with alarming speed, elegant enough to signal status, modest enough to suggest recovery. Armor designed to look like clothing. Corwin accompanied her, his hand at the small of her back as they entered, a message to every eye in the room. The room was a minefield of curiosity. Conversations fell silent as Marin passed, resumed in whispers after she moved on. Eyes tracked her with the focused attention of people watching a performance they'd paid handsomely to attend. She navigated it with composure, answering questions with the Dowager's prescribed vagueness, deflecting probes with gentle changes of subject, smiling until her face ached. It was during the refreshments that the first real blow came. Honoria Kavanagh, wife of a baronet and possessor of the sharpest tongue in 3 counties, cornered Marin near the tea table with the predatory grace of a woman who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "My dear Duchess," she said, her smile bright and surgical. "How extraordinary to have you back among us. We all thought the worst. As did I, for a time. And a child, too. How remarkable. Born during your convalescence, I understand." "Yes. How fortunate you had support. Mr. Margrave, wasn't it? Such a devoted friend to both you and the Duke." The emphasis on both was a scalpel. "One hears he was very attentive during your recovery." The insinuation was clear, deliberate, designed to wound. Marin felt the blood drain from her face, and then, with a cold clarity she hadn't known she possessed, return. "Mr. Margrave showed great compassion during the most frightening period of my life. I was injured, alone, and with child. He offered me shelter and safety when I had neither. I would hope any gentleman of character would do the same for a friend in need. Wouldn't you agree, Mrs. Kavanagh?" The question was a trap, beautifully laid. To disagree was to suggest that helping a vulnerable woman was somehow improper. To agree was to validate Marin's account. Honoria's smile stiffened. "Of course. How admirable." "I think so. My husband thinks so as well. He's expressed his gratitude to Mr. Margrave personally. But then, the Duke has always been a man who values loyalty." She walked away, hands trembling around the porcelain, heart hammering so loudly she was certain the entire room could hear it. She found a quiet corner near a window and stood there, breathing, staring at the garden without seeing it. Corwin found her 3 minutes later. "I heard," he said quietly. "Kavanagh." She implied Luelle is Anselm's. His jaw tightened. "I'll speak to her husband." "You'll do nothing. If you react, you confirm that the suggestion has merit. If we ignore it, it dies. The Dowager taught me that much, at least." He studied her face. "You handled it perfectly. I handled it through sheer terror. Most perfect things are accomplished through sheer terror." She almost smiled. But beneath the composure, Honoria's words had found their mark. Not the insinuation about Anselm, which was absurd, but the deeper wound. The reminder that this world would never simply accept her. That every day would be another performance, another test, another room full of eyes measuring her against standards she hadn't set and couldn't change. In the carriage home, Luelle asleep against Corwin's shoulder, Marin stared out the window and said nothing. The dowager, for once, didn't fill the silence. It was Corwin who finally spoke, his voice low enough not to wake the child. "You don't have to do this. The gatherings, the society, the performance. If it's too much, we find another way. I told you we'd change everything else. I meant it. You can't change society. No. But I can choose what parts of it we engage with. I can choose to make Thornfield a place where you feel safe instead of scrutinized." The carriage rocked gently over a rutted stretch of road. Luelle murmured in her sleep and burrowed deeper into Corwin's coat. "She called you Papa in her sleep last night," Marin said. "I know. I heard her through the wall." "Did you?" "I went to her room and sat with her until she settled. She was dreaming about hedgehogs." Marin's throat ached. This man, this careful, wounded, impossible man, who sat in the dark beside a daughter he'd known for barely a fortnight, and listened to her dream. "I want this to work," she whispered. "I'm just terrified it can't." "Then we'll be terrified together. That's better than being terrified alone." 2 weeks at Thornfield. They slept in separate rooms. This was understood without discussion, a boundary neither pushed against, though Marin sometimes heard Corwin's footsteps in the corridor late at night, pausing outside her door before continuing to his study. She never opened the door. He never knocked. Luelle adapted with the resilient pragmatism of childhood. The nursery became her kingdom, and within a week she'd organized it to her specifications, which involved a diplomatic incident with the dowager over whether a 4-year-old required her own writing desk. The dowager conceded with imperial dignity. "The child is willful," she told Corwin. "She's determined. Willful. Like her mother." A pause. "I've ordered the desk from London." Corwin and Marin circled each other like planets in adjacent orbits, close enough to feel the pull, but careful to maintain distance. They shared meals. They discussed Luelle's routines. They reviewed the dowager's progress on the call situation, which was proceeding with a thoroughness that suggested the dowager had been waiting her entire life for an enemy worthy of her talents. She'd been writing letters at a furious pace, and the replies that arrived bore seals and signatures that Corwin recognized from circles far above ordinary society. But they didn't talk about themselves, about the marriage, about what was growing between them in the silences, in the accidental touches, in the way their eyes met across rooms and held for a beat too long. People who've been broken don't reassemble on schedule. It was Luelle who forced the breach. On the 15th night, a storm rolled across the estate, with a violence that turned the sky green and set the horses screaming in their stalls. Thunder cracked so close the windows rattled, and Luelle, who'd been sleeping peacefully, woke screaming. Marin reached the nursery first. Luelle was sitting upright in bed, her face wet with tears, her small body shaking. Mama, the sky is breaking. It's thunder, darling. Just thunder. It can't hurt you. It's so loud. It's angry. It's not angry. It's just weather being noisy. But what if it breaks the house? It won't break the house. This house has been here for 300 years. Footsteps in the hallway. Corwin appeared in the doorway, hair disordered, a candle in his hand. His eyes found Luelle first, then Marin, and the relief on his face was so naked it hurt to look at. He crossed the room and knelt beside them, setting the candle on the nightstand. Luelle, look at me. Do you know what my father told me about thunder when I was your age? She peeked at him with one eye. What? He said thunder is the sound of the sky applauding. When lightning does something especially brilliant, the sky claps for it, like when you sing a good song and everyone claps. Llewellyn considered this with the grave attention of a philosopher evaluating a new hypothesis. The sky likes lightning? Very much. They're old friends. Can you stay, both of you, until the sky stops clapping? Corwin looked at Marin. The question in his eyes wasn't about the child. Of course, Marin said. They arranged themselves on the small bed. Within minutes, Llewellyn's breathing had slowed to the deep, trusting rhythm of a child who felt safe. In the candlelight, Corwin and Marin looked at each other across the geography of Llewellyn's tangled hair. "Your father really told you that?" Marin whispered. "No. I made it up just now." It was good. She's a demanding audience. Silence. Rain softened against the windows. "I missed you," Corwin said, barely audible. "Not the Duchess. Not the idea of you. You. The way you argue about poetry. The way you can't eat an orange without getting juice on your chin. I missed the specific, ridiculous, irreplaceable you. I missed you too, every night. I'd lie awake trying to remember what your voice sounded like, terrified of forgetting." "And did you? Forget?" "No. But I convinced myself I had. It was easier to grieve something lost than to ache for something I'd chosen to give up. You didn't give me up. You tried to protect me. You were wrong about the method, but not about the motive. That's very generous. It's very true." His hand found hers across their sleeping daughter. His fingers closed around hers, warm and careful and certain. "I'm not angry anymore, Marin. Anger requires believing someone acted out of malice, and you acted out of love. Misguided, infuriating, catastrophically self-sacrificing love, but love nonetheless. I don't know how to be your wife again. I don't know how to be the Duchess. Then don't be the Duchess. Be Marin. Be the woman who reads dragons to our daughter and keeps a battered book through the worst years of her life because it mattered more than anything else she owned. The Duchess can sort herself out later." "Corwin, yes. I'm going to do something I should have done years ago." "What's that?" "Trust you." She lifted his hand to her lips and kissed his knuckles, gently, without performance or pretense. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a woman holding her husband's hand over their sleeping child and choosing, finally, to stop running. They fell asleep like that, hands linked across the pillow, uncomfortable and impractical and entirely undignified. It was also the first night in years that either of them slept without dreaming of loss. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, addressed to Corwin, unfamiliar handwriting, plain wax seal. He read it at the breakfast table, and his expression simply closed, shutters drawn, locks engaged. "Call," he said. "He wants a meeting. Tomorrow evening, at the 3 Crowns Inn. He claims to have new documents, ones linking Marin directly to the intelligence operations. Letters she supposedly wrote. Correspondence that proves she wasn't merely the daughter of an intermediary, but an active participant." "That's a lie," Marin said. "I was a child when my father was doing that work. I never wrote anything. I believe you. But belief and proof are different currencies." His jaw tightened. "There's more. He mentions Llewellyn. He says if his terms aren't met, he'll ensure her legitimacy is publicly questioned." "That's monstrous," Marin whispered. "It's strategic," the Dowager said flatly. "He's attacking from multiple angles. Espionage documents threaten reputation. The paternity question threatens the succession. He's constructed a pincer movement, crude but effective." Marin looked at Corwin. "He can't prove that. He can't prove anything about Llewellyn's parentage because there's nothing to prove. She's yours. I know she's mine. But proof and insinuation operate in different theaters, and he knows it." Corwin folded the letter with deliberate care and placed it beside his plate. A whisper in the right ear at the right dinner party would do more damage than a stack of documents. By the time the truth caught up, the story would have its own momentum. "I'm going to meet him," Corwin said. "Not without me," Marin said. "I'm part of every decision, remember?" "Marin, don't. Don't try to protect me from this. That's what started everything. I am coming with you." He used my name, my father's name, and now my daughter's name. I want to look him in the eye. Corwin studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. That evening, after Luelle was asleep, Marin found Corwin in the library. He was standing at the window, staring at the darkened grounds, his reflection a ghost in the glass. "I'm afraid," he said. She crossed the room to him. "I know. Not of call, not of scandal. I'm afraid that this will break us, that we'll survive the external threat, and discover that the damage we've done to each other is worse than anything he could inflict. Corwin, I trusted you completely. You were the one person in my life I trusted without reservation, and you used that trust to disappear. You took our child and vanished, and let me believe you were dead. And I understand why. I've forgiven why. But the scar is still there, Marin. I can feel it every time you leave a room. Every time I can't see Luelle for more than an hour. This fear that I'll turn around and you'll be gone again." Marin took his hands. They were cold. "I'm not going anywhere. You said that before, the morning you left for Dover. You kissed me goodbye and said you'd be back by Thursday." The words opened something old and terrible between them. She saw it in his face, the morning she'd left, the last ordinary morning of their marriage. She'd kissed him at the door of his study. He'd been reading correspondence. He'd looked up, smiled, said something about saving the good marmalade. And she'd walked away knowing she might not come back and hadn't told him. "I can't undo it," she said. "I can't unlive that morning or unmake that choice. But I can promise you that I will never, as long as I breathe, make a decision about our family alone again. Not out of fear, not out of protection, not for any reason. We face everything together, even if together is harder, even if together is terrifying." He pulled her close, pressing his forehead against hers. They stood there in the library, holding each other in the firelight. Two people who'd already survived the worst thing they could do to each other, and were now trying to survive the world, doing its worst instead. "Tomorrow," he said, "we face call together. Together." He kissed her, not gently, not carefully, not with the tentative caution that had characterized every interaction since the stable at Briarsgate. He kissed her like a man who'd spent years remembering what it felt like to hold the person he loved, and was done pretending that memory was enough. She kissed him back, with everything, with years of loneliness and regret, and the desperate, ferocious hope that it wasn't too late to rebuild what she'd demolished. When they parted, breathless, she said, "That was impulsive. My mother would disagree. She'd say it was overdue." The Three Crowns was a coaching inn of respectable reputation and unremarkable appearance, the kind of place where transactions happened in private rooms, and the staff had been trained to forget faces as quickly as they learned them. Severin Call was already waiting. He was not what Marin had expected. Older, heavier, dressed with the careful tastelessness of someone who'd studied wealth without understanding it. His smile was the kind that never reached his eyes. "Your Grace." And the Duchess, risen from the dead. How biblical. "Mr. Call," Corwin said. His voice was ice poured into a glass. "Sit down. This won't take long." "Won't it? I was hoping we might discuss matters at length. There's so much to cover." Call's gaze slid to Marin. "You look well, Your Grace. Better than I expected for a woman who spent years hiding in a bachelor's house." "You mentioned documents," Corwin said, ignoring the provocation. I want to see them. Call produced a leather folder and laid it on the table with the satisfaction of a card player, revealing a winning hand. Letters, memoranda, fabricated correspondence, supposedly in Marin's handwriting. He also claimed to have a journal in her father's handwriting, detailing specific operations and their outcomes. You're admitting to forgery, Corwin said. I'm admitting to preparation. There's a difference. He laid out his demands with methodical patience. The meeting continued for 40 minutes. 40 minutes of Call presenting his position with the confidence of a man who believed he held every advantage. Access to political figures. Introductions to specific members of the House of Lords. A letter of recommendation from the Duke of Thornfield endorsing his commercial ventures. And, as a final flourish, a sum of money so large that even Corwin's expression flickered. You have 1 week, Call said, closing the folder. After that, I begin sharing my collection with interested parties, starting, I think, with the Morning Chronicle. They do enjoy a good scandal. They left the inn in silence. In the carriage, Marin sat rigid, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. The documents Call had shown them were convincing. Not real, but convincing. And in the arena of public opinion, the distinction was academic. We need your mother, she said. I know. This is bigger than I thought. He's not just threatening exposure. He's built a case, a fabricated one, but structured to withstand initial scrutiny. By the time anyone proved the letters were forged, the damage would be done. Corwin reached across the carriage and took her hand. We have a week. My mother has contacts. We have Anselm as witness to your character and circumstances. And we have something Call doesn't know about. What? The truth. And a 63-year-old woman who's been waiting her entire life for a fight this dirty. The Dowager received the intelligence about Call's demands with an expression of delighted fury. It was the face of a woman who'd been handed exactly the provocation she needed. The fool. He put the forged documents on the table. He let you see them. He's so confident in his leverage that he's handed us the evidence to destroy him. That only matters if we can prove they're forged. Of course they're forged. Your father-in-law was a careful man, Marin. He kept meticulous records, and those records were collected by the Home Office after his death. Marin stared. You knew? About my father's work? I've known since before your wedding. Did you think I would allow my son to marry a vicar's daughter without conducting a thorough investigation? I know everything about your family, Marin, including the parts your father took pains to conceal. And you said nothing. Your father served his country. His file was closed with commendation, not censure. If Call's documents were genuine, they'd contradict the official record, which means they're fabricated, and I can prove it. Corwin sank into a chair. You've had this information for years. I kept it because revealing it meant admitting I'd investigated your wife behind your back, which I did, and which I would do again without hesitation, because protecting this family is my purpose, and I will not apologize for being thorough. Marin felt something unexpected, not anger at the invasion, but a strange, disorienting gratitude. The Dowager had known everything, the intelligence work, the risks, the potential for scandal, and had married Corwin to her anyway. Had spent 3 years polishing her, correcting her, criticizing her, all while knowing that the vicar's daughter she publicly disparaged was the daughter of a man who'd served his country at considerable personal risk. You chose me, Marin said, knowing everything. I chose my son's happiness. Don't confuse that with choosing you. But the Dowager's voice softened, barely perceptibly. Though I will concede that you weren't the worst option available. The Dowager's plan unfolded with military elegance. Letters were dispatched to contacts in the Home Office, the Foreign Office, and places that didn't have official names, but responded to the Dowager's correspondence with alarming promptness. A retired intelligence officer named Haldane was summoned to Thornfield. He was a spare, precise man who wore spectacles and carried a magnifying glass and looked like the kind of person who found human interaction and inefficient use of time better spent examining ink samples. He worked for 2 days without speaking to anyone except to request better light, stronger tea, and the cessation of the Dowager's habit of looking over his shoulder. On the 3rd morning, he presented his findings with the measured satisfaction of a craftsman examining inferior work. Forgeries. Everyone. The ink is wrong for the period. It contains an aniline compound, not commercially available before 1815, while these letters are supposedly dated 1807. The paper is commercially available and can be purchased at any stationer's in London. The handwriting analysis is conclusive. Whoever wrote these consistently misforms the lowercase g and the capital R, and the letters supposedly from the Duchess reference events that occurred while she was demonstrably at Thornfield. One mentions a meeting in Dover on a date when the Thornfield household records show her hosting a dinner for 12. On the 6th day, they returned to the 3 Crowns, not 2 of them this time, but 5. Corwin, Marin, the Dowager in diamonds, and devastating composure. Haldane with his annotated case, and Anselm as witness. Call's confidence wavered when he saw the party. He'd expected 2. He got 5. "Mr. Call," the Dowager said, taking the chair opposite with the authority of someone claiming a throne. "I believe you've been threatening my family." She laid out the case with devastating precision. Haldane's expert findings, the Home Office records, the magistrate who was a personal friend, the editor of the Morning Chronicle, who was her goddaughter's husband and who would sooner set his own printing press on fire than publish unverified slander about the Thornfield family. "You have 2 options. Surrender every document, leave England, and never contact this family again, and we don't pursue criminal charges. Or I destroy you. Completely. You chose to threaten my grandchild's legitimacy, Mr. Call. Grandmothers are not known for restraint when children are involved." The silence was absolute. Call looked at each of them in turn. At the Dowager, immovable. At Corwin, whose expression promised that anything his mother left standing, he would finish. At Marin, who met his eyes without flinching. At Haldane, whose testimony could end careers. At Anselm, who sat with his loyalty visible. "Option 1, Call said. "A sensible choice." In the carriage afterward, the silence felt different from every silence before. Light. The lightness of a burden set down after so long the body had forgotten what weightlessness felt like. "Mother," Corwin said, "thank you." "Don't be sentimental. I did what was necessary." "You did what was magnificent." "Same thing." The Sinclair autumn ball blazed against the October night like a jewel set in dark velvet. Marin stood at the top of the grand staircase in a gown of midnight blue silk, embroidered with silver thread that caught the candlelight. The sapphires at her throat had belonged to Corwin's mother, and the Dowager had presented them that evening with a gruffness that failed entirely to disguise the significance. "They were hers," the Dowager said. "Now they're yours. Try not to lose them. They're worth more than this house." "Ready?" Corwin murmured beside her. "No." "Good. Neither am I." They descended together. The ballroom fell quiet in stages, conversations dying like candles blown out one by one as heads turned. Marin felt every gaze, every whisper, every fan raised to conceal a comment. She lifted her chin and smiled. Not the careful, defensive smile she'd worn at Whitmore House. A real smile, earned and imperfect. The smile of someone who'd survived the worst and was still standing. The orchestra began. "May I have this dance, Your Grace?" She took his hand. They moved onto the floor together, and the room watched. "Everyone is staring," Marin whispered. "I know. Honoria Kavanagh looks like she swallowed something unpleasant." "That's her standard expression. I've always assumed it's architectural rather than emotional." Marin laughed, actually laughed, out loud, in the middle of the Sinclair ballroom, and the sound of it was so unexpected, so entirely human, amid the gilded performance of society, that several nearby couples turned with genuine surprise. "I love you," Corwin said, quietly, under the music, for no one but her. "Not because you came back, not because you gave me Luelle. I love you because you're Marin, because you make me want to be present. Not the Duke, not the title. Me." The Dowager appeared at the edge of the floor after the waltz. She crossed to Marin, took her hand, and turned to face the room with the air of a general who has won a campaign and is now accepting the surrender of the opposition. "I believe you all know my daughter-in-law," she said, her voice carrying with the practiced projection of a woman who'd been commanding rooms for 6 decades. "The Duchess of Thornfield returned to us after a prolonged illness. We are grateful for your continued friendship and discretion." It was not an explanation. It was a decree. And from the Dowager Duchess of Thornfield, decrees were obeyed. Lady Sinclair began the applause. Others followed. Not unanimous, not thunderous, but steady and real. The sound of a community choosing, for the moment, to accept the official narrative and welcome back one of its own. The evening unfolded like a story, finding its rhythm. Marin danced with Corwin twice more, then with Anselm, who stepped on her feet apologetically and whispered that he was happier than he'd been in years. She spoke with women who were cautious but kind, with lords who were curious but courteous, with Lady Sinclair, who pressed her hand warmly and invited her to tea the following week with a sincerity that felt like the beginning of genuine friendship. And when Honoria Kavanagh approached, her expression carefully neutral, Marin met her with composure and without malice. "Mrs. Kavanagh, how lovely to see you. Your Grace, you look very well. The Duke seems pleased." "He does, doesn't he?" Marin smiled. "I'm rather pleased myself. It's remarkable what surviving the impossible does for one's perspective." The evening ended late, long past the hour when respectable families retreated to their carriages. In theirs, Marin leaned against Corwin's shoulder, exhausted and exhilarated, and felt his arm come around her with the easy certainty of someone who'd been holding her for years, lost her, and would not let go again. "You survived," he said. "We survived." "Same thing." The Dowager, dozing in the opposite seat, murmured without opening her eyes. "If you two are going to be sentimental, please do it quietly. Some of us are trying to rest after saving the family's reputation single-handedly." "Double-handedly," Marin corrected gently. "At least." One eye opened, regarded her, closed again. "Triple-handedly," the Dowager conceded. "At most." 6 months later, on a morning in early spring, Marin found a letter. She was in the Thornfield Library, which had become her sanctuary, the room where she read to Luelle in the afternoons and debated literature with Corwin in the evenings, and occasionally sat alone in the quiet, simply breathing, simply being present in a life she'd almost lost. The letter was tucked into the pages of the Doniote, the copy she'd carried through everything, the book that had survived her death and resurrection because some things are too important to leave behind. It was in Corwin's handwriting, but not recent. The paper was older, slightly yellowed, the ink faded. She opened it carefully. "My darling Marin, I am writing this in the study, a year after the funeral. I know you'll never read it. I know you're gone. But I need to say what I couldn't say at the service, what I can't say to anyone, because they would try to comfort me. And comfort is the last thing I want. I want you. I want the sound of your voice arguing about poetry. I want the way you can't eat an orange without getting juice on your chin. I want your hand in mine at the opera, your laughter in the garden, your absolute refusal to let me win any argument simply because I'm a duke. I want the life we were building, the children we talked about, the years we planned. I want all of it, and it's gone, and I don't know how to exist in the space where it used to be. Your father's Don Quixote sits on my shelf. He believed idealism was necessary, even when it was madness. Loving you was idealism. Believing it could last was madness. And I would do it again. Every moment. Every heartbreak. Every terrible, beautiful second. Yours, in this life and whatever comes after. Corwin Marin sat in the library with the letter in her hands and wept. Not with grief, not with guilt, with the overwhelming, devastating gratitude of a woman who'd been given the extraordinary gift of knowing exactly how much she was loved during the time she was lost. She was still crying when Corwin found her. "What's this?" he asked, then saw the letter. His face went still. "I forgot I'd put that there." "Did you mean it?" "Every word. I wrote it believing you'd never read it." "And now?" He sat beside her, took the letter gently from her hands, and pulled her against his chest, while the spring light moved across the library floor and the house hummed with the sounds of living. Luelle singing somewhere upstairs, the dowager's voice issuing instructions to some unfortunate servant, the old rhythms of a great house continuing. "Now," he said, "I don't need to write letters to a ghost. I have the real thing. Complicated, infuriating, impossible, and here." "Here," she agreed. "I'm here." Outside the library windows, the Thornfield Gardens were coming back to life after winter. New growth pushing through old soil, crocuses in the borders, green shoots along the hedgerows, the first tentative blossoms on the apple trees that lined the south walk. And inside, in the library that smelled of paper and cedar and warmth, the Duke of Thornfield and his impossible resurrected Duchess sat together among the books and watched the spring arrive. Some stories end with a grand gesture. This one ended with a morning, with sunlight and silence, and two people who'd learned that love wasn't a single brave act, but a daily, deliberate choice to stay present, to stay honest, to stay. Thank you for being here. You are the reason these stories exist, because you believe in love that fights through the impossible, in characters who choose truth over safety, in endings that feel earned because they were. Your presence makes this space warm and meaningful, and I am grateful for every moment you spend with these characters. Do you have a favorite line or scene? Your engagement helps me understand what moves you, what keeps you listening, and what kinds of stories to create next. Consider subscribing if you'd like more stories with emotional depth and genuine character growth. Thank you for being here. You make this community what it is.